Kind of going back to the genetic disposition, is there any literature reviews out there that are considering the direct correlation between an untreated parent and a child who's predisposed to the eating disorder? I actually kind of have a couple of questions. So that being said, what is the difference between the phobia and the control issues involved with eating disorders? So I don't know.
So the genetic predisposition, you get about a 12-time increase if a parent has an eating disorder. And so much so, similar to alcoholism, if you have a parent who's alcoholic, at some point the children need to be taught that they're at risk for developing that illness. If you have a parent with an eating disorder, it's important to educate the family and educate the children that you're at higher risk for developing an eating disorder. So there's a lot of research that's coming out of Stanford and then the UCSD down in San Diego with Walter Kay that's talking about genetics and trying to find that link. They don't think they're ever going to find a specific gene related to eating disorders. They've been trying for about 10 years now. They don't think they're going to be able to isolate it. But just in twin studies and other research that they've done, there's a tremendously strong genetic predisposition, and you see it run in families.
Do you think there's a difference in having a parent who, at the time, having a parent who is actively having an eating disorder versus a parent who may have been treated and has in recovery?
Yeah, they've talked about that quite a bit. So the socialization part of it, where you're around people engaging in eating disorder behavior, certainly is going to be impactful. But a lot of the research that they're doing right now is showing some of the genetics and some of the biological vulnerabilities that are happening start early in life. You know, for example, about 60 to 70% of people with anorexia have early onset anxiety, meaning as little kids they were very anxious and tend to be perfectionistic, and that is believed to be a precursor to developing an eating disorder. Now that doesn't mean if you have an anxious child that you're going to develop an eating disorder. It just adds a risk factor, basically, something to pay attention to. Now that number is so high that some of the researchers are starting to say, hey, why don't we do some prevention work and identify the third graders that are really anxious and go into the classrooms and do something to help them cope with their anxiety in hopes that we can prevent the later development of an eating disorder.
Question?
Yeah, you also had a second part, though, in your question.
It was the phobia versus the control issues. Because we addressed the...
I think phobia and control go hand in hand. I think the idea of when you're afraid of something, you want to feel that you can control both your access or your exposure to it. And when there's something in part of your life that you feel out of control, if you tend to be a little compulsive or anxious, you may tend to want to control more in other areas as a way to feel safe. Because you feel better with these people if you know what's going to happen. You don't want the unknown.
Just like my cleaning, now that I can't control, now that I have control over my eating, I kind of built some more control. I've always been a clean person, but now, ever since this and ever since I got help, now I have this big control issue over making sure that everything is in its place at all times. If not, my anxiety level will go up. So that also happens as well.
So part of the control that I've always seen is that, if you wake up in the morning, your first thought is, and I hope I'm highly anxious throughout the day. I hope I have one panic attack after the next, after the next. Anxiety is such a horrible feeling to have that we'll do virtually anything to avoid it. And so part of the control is I like Barbara's explanation of it being a phobia, because I think that's very, very accurate. So if I'm phobic of elevators, let's say, what do? I control that anxiety by avoiding elevators. And so eating disorder behavior for a lot of patients is all about anxiety reduction. If I can just avoid this, I'm not going to feel anxious. If I can't avoid it, I'm going to feel anxious. And so for me, a lot of the behaviors subjectively are patients trying to avoid the experience of anxiety or trying to avoid exacerbating their anxiety.
And I think that applies not just to the one end of the spectrum, which is the anorexic spectrum, which is restrict, I'm avoiding food. I'm going to control my anxiety by not eating at all, which is an extremely difficult thing to do because every ounce of your body is screaming for food. You're hungry, your body is saying, I need food. So you are going against your body's survival instincts by refusing to feed it. And then maybe you can only last so long, so then you binge, or and a binge, when I say binge with working with clients, that means I felt out of control. A binge for somebody who's anorexic could be a leaf of lettuce.
Yeah.
Or maybe three, that would be really overdoing it. So now I've lost control. And then the other part of some eating disorders is the idea of a purging behavior. Now I've got this in me, I couldn't control it, now this is in me and I have to get rid of it somehow. And there's a number of ways people might do that. Or there's people who binge eating or overeating. I can't control the amount that I eat and now I'm distressed. Or I get distressed and the way I calm myself is by eating. So again, it's all management of distress or anxiety.
For Jamie, how do you help them to change their relationship with food? Because you can't tell them eat more.
Yeah.
But how do you tell them?
So we do it, there's many different ways we do it, so I'll just kind of give you an overview. But when we start in PHP, which is partial hospitalization program, which is what we start at usually in Summit, which means they're there 7 days a week, all day long. What I do is I start by giving them a meal plan, and we start with, okay, go into the meals and eat the food. That's the only goal, whatever food it is. So, and then if it's evening IOP or outpatient, my first goal is to have them identify some foods they feel safe with and eat an amount that is appropriate for them in order to maintain or gain weight, whatever our goal is. And having an eating schedule that is consistent so that we don't go from one end of the spectrum to another. So we don't go from restricting, feeling so starving, which I say is primal hunger, to getting to the point where you're so full that you feel the urge to purge. So kind of more of a consistent intake. Then the next level is to start to introduce some of their fear foods. So some of those foods that the food police, which I had a client the other day, we did this activity and they drew like their foods with food police clothes on it that they were scared of, and so that was actually a good activity, and they wrote their fears of the food. So I have them identify what those are. So for some people, it may be more of a volume thing. They're scared of a volume of food. They're scared of getting nauseous. They're scared of all of those things. Whereas for another person, it might be really that they're scared of a cookie, or they're scared of French fries, or that they're scared of going out. And so what we do is we slowly introduce those foods to them, and first we just talk about them. And we break them down, like, okay, why are you scared of the cookie? What does it mean if you eat a cookie? And kind of break it down even nutritionally to, okay, so what's the difference between an almond and, a handful of almonds and your fear of, let's say they're scared of butter. So there's obviously a difference nutritionally, but our bodies can break down fat the same way, right? And although the fat content of those two things are different, your body sees it as fat and uses it for different processes to build hormones and all those things. So I'll go through those things with them and really get down to the basics. And so as we go through that, though, it's also important to recognize what are they using food for, And that goes back to kind of the therapy step, but we do that in our sessions as well, is like, what does the food mean to you? What are you using it for? How are you using your food, these fears of food, to cope with your emotions? And so we kind of talk about those things and get to the bottom of, food is really just food, and how do we create a relationship with it that's healthy? And if you want to look up the principles that I actually talk about with my patients, I talk about the intuitive eating principles. And so you can find those online, and it's Evelyn Tribole and Elise Rouge who came up with them, and they are excellent. So it's basically a guide to reteach people what normal eating is. Because I don't know if you guys have been out in the world lately, but dieting is everywhere.
So there are so many messages about carbohydrates, about fat, about this, about that. And I mean, one of my biggest, I think, struggles right now is convincing people that carbohydrates are good for you, because there's been such a big push on message against them. So it's explaining why we use carbohydrates in the body and why it's bad to restrict carbohydrate intake. And so I do a lot of education. Now, in the very beginning, they're not ready to hear any of that, so it doesn't really matter, but it's a kind of a slow process of reintroducing a combination of education and exposures. So really doing exposures. I go out probably at least twice a week with my patients to different restaurants. We did a donut challenge the other week that was like, sent the therapists into like frenzy because they're like, man, you guys didn't tell us ahead of time. But it was really good. Yeah. But it was really good because it brought up all these fears and all these emotions, and talking through, you know, it's just a donut. It's not the end of the world. And convincing them of that when there's a message out in our society about the kind of person you are if you eat a donut is very difficult. And so that's kind of part of my job that I do a lot of.
The other thing that's going on while she's trying to give them the correct information, the intellectual stuff to fight that food police that's on the other side. So you've got, you know, Jamie on one side and you've got the food police on the other. They're, at the same time, most of these people have a distorted body image where they actually look in the mirror, and if they're underweight, they actually see themselves as fat. And nobody can understand that. People will tell them, honey, you are not, you're skinny. They actually believe they're being lied to, right? Yeah, you are lying, you're just telling me that to make me feel good.
To make me eat.
To make me eat. You just want to make me fatter. Yeah.
And that's been a mystery for years. Like, how can someone who's emaciated look in the mirror and see herself as being fat? And what we've discovered is that there's a part of the brain that's responsible for visual acuity and interpretation is having to overwork to compensate for another part of the brain that's underworking. And so we've kind of sat back and, it makes sense, because this part of the brain that's responsible specifically for that is kind of misfiring because it's having to overwork. And so it's been a mystery, but for the patient, he or she really sees themselves that way because the brain is feeding them misinformation. And that's why it's so hard to convince them otherwise. Because it's like you're saying something totally off because my brain is telling me, I'm seeing it with my eyes. You know, what are you talking about? And that's been a source of frustration for such a long, long time. But we now understand kind of the biological makeup of that.